All right, well, we'll go ahead and start. Welcome everyone to what is going to be a powerful session with some powerful, amazing women. And we just want to welcome your full self into this space, your critical self, your activist self, your professional self, your personal self. Welcome it into this space to have this critical and hopefully like creative conversation. We're starting with radical, right? The first word of our title is radical, and a lot of times like the term radical gets a bad rap, right? Like, you know, people put the word radical on extremism, terrorism, whatever, and it's very intentional that this is done because the word radical, actually its etymology has to do with root, the forming of a root, getting at the root of something. And really give the history, or what radical really means, is inherent to evaluation. All of us should be radical, right? All of us should be really getting at the root of issues, at the root of the truth. And here we're talking about getting at the root of what constructs nations that have been oppressive to certain groups of people, and using evaluation to actually be a solution, to lead to the solution of that, to lead towards true and real and lasting equity for all of us. So we are going to be talking about this pathway and strategies to actually disrupt the discriminatory status quo and create the reality that we all want and need. And this involves the lens that we're looking through, who's doing the looking, how we're doing the evaluation, how we're both interrogating our own processes in research and evaluation, as well as the evaluand and the potential results and outcomes of the evaluation. We do collectively hold the stance that evaluation should be used as a tool for social change, that evaluators should be agents of social change. Even if we don't recognize it, we are influencing the process and the evaluation. So let's influence it in a way that's deliberate and a way that's towards equity and thriving for everyone. And so the presenters probably do not need an introduction because each one is very well known. But Donna Mertens, Katrina, Bledsoe, Gail, Dana, Sacco are going to be diving into strategies around creating this possible reality through evaluation and disrupting the status quo. So we're going to start with Katrina, then go to Gail, and then go to Donna. So I'll kick it to Katrina to start us off.
Why did I not think that it was me who was going to be talking first? But I am. So let me try and share my screen. As some of you know, I am not the best person at PowerPoints, but I'm just going to speak. And so let me, I'm going to try to keep this brief, but Donna knows that I always fail at that. So I'm going to try really, really hard. But if you see sort of a weariness on my part, and it's only 11:45 or noon here on the East Coast, I think it's just weary because of all the stuff that's going on. And then, you know, in your own life, and then also just in general. So I'm going to try to be as forthright and in the middle as I possibly can. But I call this Acknowledging Research and Evaluation's Colonized, Ready for Change or Scared Silent. I don't know, it just sounded like a really good title to me. But we will sort of talk a little bit about this. And I just sort of wanted to spend a moment to acknowledge historical roots. I was born in Riverside County, California. For those of you know, it's sort of like a desert suburb of LA, on what was previously known as the Colorado Desert Lands in the 19th century. And it is home to and is the land of California indigenous people, including the Coahuilla, the Gabrielino, Serrano, Luiso, Chemehueve, and Mojave tribes. I currently reside, even though I go back to California quite a bit, in Arlington County, Virginia, which is home to and land of the Potomac indigenous people. So I just wanted to acknowledge that, because of the fact that we need to acknowledge the land that we stole, and then the fact that we stole other people to go work on the stolen land. Just saying. Also, I wanted to sort of take a moment to just sort of dive right in. And I sort of led up by saying we stole land from people and then we stole other people to work our stolen land. I'm probably being really nice, but that sort of like, given that history, everything that we have really is kind of based on that. And so it also is that way in the way that we think about research and evaluation. Just get to the space. Research and evaluation is supposed to be that space where we are the objective, the folks who are sort of like, we have no ties to anything. But as Dominica mentioned, we are part of this society. We are part of a society. We are social change agents because we live here. We are part of this. We're not just people who are standing on the sides. We are very much involved. So in that space, we have also, our training really a lot has been very much in the space of how the country was brought, the systemic racism and sexism and anti-immigrant status issues that we have. And it's very, very much based in the white racial frame. Now, before anybody gets all bent out of shape, because you are at the Center for Culturally Responsive Evaluation and Assessment Conference, this is what we're talking about, because I know everybody's talking about this right now, and there's EDI, all of that, and a lot of fake witty going around. But if you're in this space and you're in this room, this is what we're going to have to deal with. Otherwise, you can't make a change. So anyway, I just want to say, here's the way, this is what I call it, the white racial frame in research. And this is adapted from Tema Okun, and this is about 2002, and it's Dismantling Racism. I put it in the research frame. These are the traits of our field that we do. Perfectionism. Everything's got to be perfect. Everything is a sense of urgency. And we all know that. How many times have we been on many projects and many initiatives where there's a time frame that is urgent, only to not really have anything come out of it? Quantity over quality. We do that in the way that we eat, let alone the way that we see the world and how we put our strategies and our initiatives together. We worship the written word because that's supposed to be the word that we say that gets out and how people can move forward. Objectivity, as I mentioned before, is the thing that we say we strive for all the time, that we're trying not to be involved, and that to be involved and to care somehow compromises the people that we are and how we feel. We also want to be comfortable. You hear that evaluators in a lot of ways, oh, I don't engage in social advocacy. I don't do social justice. I don't do any of that. We're not supposed to do that because we all want to be comfortable and go home to our glass of wine or your coffee or whatever it is at night. That's the right to comfort that we're feeling. This fear of open conflict, again, I sort of start this out sort of slightly aggressively in the sense of that without conflict, we don't move forward in a way. And conflict in a lot of ways, to me, shows that we care. But the other piece of this sort of white racial frame in research is that progress is bigger and more. How many times we heard from everybody talking about scaling up, trying to model, make it bigger, make it better. And that there is one particular way to do things, that one particular truth, one particular perspective, and that we all tend to worry about who's hoarding power. It really is about who's hoarding power and who has the power. So I just sort of wanted to sort of put that out there because our field and our practice is really steeped in that. And without that acknowledgement, we can't do the work of trying to actually move social justice forward. My colleague Leon Caldwell and I wrote a paper a couple of years ago that now just seems low key, but then when it was written, which was really about social justice and how can we talk about doing social justice, about equity, diversity, and inclusion if we cannot admit the issues that plague the field as well. So let me go to my next slide. So I just wanted to have a couple of considerations. This is from House's 2017 paper. And based on his 2015 talk, actually, when he actually sort of called out, and I appreciate that, even though we'd all been talking about it for a while, but I really appreciate that from House, calling out that the field struggles with racism as much as anybody else. And I'm going to talk about racism as the grounding piece, because that's how we sort of move our lives in this country. But we want to keep in mind that there is an intersectionality, and that the longer we spend not dealing with race, the less we can get to the issues of intersectionality and how people live their lives in many, many spaces, and complex lives at that. Anyway, going back to House's suppositions of 2017, he says that if a society sees itself as democratic and in many ways is democratic, and yet is racist and doesn't recognize the extent or nature of the racism, the society will promulgate programs and policies that purport to help the affected minorities. And his supposition number 2 was racism in America is not a simple vestige of the past. Rather, American racism is created and recreated in the present. And we know that. We have seen it with the murders that we have actually gotten to witness on television. They were always there, but many murders had occurred. We know that missing folks from Indigenous and other communities of color have long known this and have struggled with it. But now that we have gotten a chance to see it because we were all home during a pandemic, now this has great meaning for all of us. And then finally, supposition number 3, which is evaluation plays an important role in these processes. It's not necessarily a cause of the racism, but I would argue with that a little bit. But for racist processes to have their effects, the evaluation function must be distorted, co-opted, and corrupted, and used to perpetuate racist policies, structures, and procedures. And I added that little background there myself. So just sort of some things about like where we, in House's space, even for him with that long history to get to the point where he was willing to admit this was a key. I appreciated that, again, even though we all knew this for a very long time. So there was this sort of promulgated a larger section in AJE that was published at the end of 2018 that had several writers, including Veronica Thomas, whose article was really about this idea of how we put together programs and how we evaluate them, and how we come in as evaluators. And she asked several questions. One of these were, how is reality defined and by whom? Whose reality is given privilege? And also, what are the social justice implications of accepting research that has not been subjected to a critical analysis based on power differentials? And I would argue race, gender differentials as well. And how can methods be adapted for diverse groups to shed light on the causal interpretation of reality? And finally, how we're just marginalizing and tokenizing evaluators of color. That 5th one is one that I will say that I feel like I am experiencing every single day right now. Because with this call towards the equity and diversity and inclusion, all of a sudden evaluators are running out going, my God, we really should have a really diverse team, and it's got to have meaning. So let's go find some folks that we know. And then the phone rings. And for those of you who might be experiencing that in different spaces, either because you're a woman or because you're transgendered or whatever the latest flavor that everyone says that should be, this is a big one that evaluation really has to deal with as well. But these are the questions that Veronica talks about, and she and Pat Campbell have out their new book that delves a little bit more into that. I also want to give a shout out to Donna Mertens, who's on this call, because she and her colleague, Amy Wilson, have also been delving into this space. And it's nice to have those 2 books out there and training books to sort of bring this to life, because this is where the field is going, like it or not. Hop the train or get run over by it. Next slide here. I also mentioned in that section was Marvin Hall's comments. And Marvin Hall also wrote an article sort of like as sort of like the answer to, at least I saw it that way, the answer to House's perspective about the white racial frame, and he talks about that that the white racial frame compromises the validity of evaluation methods. And you can go back to that frame that I was talking about there. And it doesn't always consider social mores, suggestions of those who are the focus of the evaluation. And then he suggests that we write about evaluation and how we think about race and its relationship to evaluation should be rethought. He also brings up Stanfield in 1998, who had the courage to talk about evaluation needing to admit that it was structurally racist and that it otherizes way of knowing. But you'll notice it's 1998. So it's been like, 23 years before we get to the point that we're willing to have that conversation. And we also need to admit that evaluation is a political endeavor. And all of this is wrapped up in the way that we do our work. So I think I'm sort of saying a couple of things here in the space of that evaluators have got to get on the train here in the sense of how we do our work. I know this isn't what we were planning on doing. This wasn't how we were all trained. And I mean, everybody was trained in this. I know I'll get some feedback, including from the folks who are folks of color, but we were all trained to look to be white facing. Yeah, and I call it white facing in the sense of facing towards white supremacy. And we all have to train ourselves out of it. And this has to be a space that we play in. So Caldwell, my colleague Leon Caldwell and I wrote our article, which really sort of tried to think about some other ways that we might think about evaluation and questioning whether evaluation is really this space that we can do social justice work in. And so at the time we looked at Michael Patton's questions, and we thought about how the lens of race shapes our understanding and actions as evaluators. We wanted to sort of play on some of these words. How do we talk to each other about race and racism? I've still noticed that that's a really tough conversation to have for a lot of us. And I've even heard people saying, do we really have to talk about this again? And my thought is, yes, you do. So how do we make ourselves condition the sort of like, how do we make ourselves aware of such conditioning in our own field and its implications, and how do we understand things? So just sort of some ideas about, thinking differently about the questions that Michael Patton asked, which I really appreciate. But the last question that Leon and I both really like, which is, given the reality, the shaping power of racial categories, in particular, what is meaningful and what is powerful? How do we think about race? How can we think about race? Is race a real construct? Or is that something that we really need to think about? I always say that I think, and we can go through a lot of different things, that it's a social construct. Of course, it has no biological meaning whatsoever. And in fact, the biologists who have truly been studying this work have debunked that probably about 20 years ago. So just saying. Anyway, I'm going to say a couple of words. Donna, I just wanted to say, and this was one of the things from EDC as well, but I just wanted to say you will recognize this because this is some of the work that you have influenced. It really starts with the way that we think about our philosophy of science, how we think about research, what's our paradigm about doing this, our axiology. We have been told there are certain things that we should value and other things that we shouldn't, but really what is good, what is right? And it's really about cultural norms, the support for human rights and social justice. That's the axiology when you're talking in this space. When we're talking about the ontology, we reject this whole idea of that there's one particular truth and there's one reality. We privilege the perceived experience of people based on their social, political, cultural, disability, positionality, and where they stand as well. And then the epistemology, which is knowledge is socially and historically located. It is socially constructed. And it really is based on a trusting relationship. And then finally, the methodology that we think about is there are multiple ways to think about methodology. And I like to call them the big five: interviews, focus groups, surveys, observations, and document reviews. What do we do past those? What happens when we are in different communities, different spaces, different realities? So these are the things that we have to really talk about. And thank you, Donna. I appreciate that for that space. So I'm going to just sort of try to get to the point here. And you would never know I was a Californian because I talk really fast, but I'm going to say we really need to rethink our current research paradigm. We got to rethink the way that the whole qualitative and quantitative debate. I can't believe we're in 2021. We're squarely in here and we're still having that debate to the point where it shut eval talk down. One of the things doing that, seriously. And then we're trying to think about traditional frameworks. We've got to think about our ideas past that. Trying to the siloing of culture and inequity discussions, the fact that we're at a CREA conference and we're still not quite having them at the AEA conference the way we should be, that says a lot right there. We also need to think about the way that we think about theories of change. What does that mean? Does it really have to go from left to right? What about rationality? What's considered rational? And then the idea of colonization of methods. We still use the methods of the master, just saying that because it's really starting to feel like slavery around here. And then, and I say that with all intent. And then the racialization and genderization of the field, this idea of like, oh, well, there are a lot of women, there are a lot of people of color. How much credibility must we have if we've got all those folks in there? So what are we moving towards? We're moving towards culturally responsive approaches, equitable approaches, transformative approaches, indigenous approaches, multiple perspectives, and embracing the complexity of the way that we live and in which we live and do our work. And then dismantling this timing and this urgency. How many times have we all been in the space where we have actually rushed to do something only to see it not change? Maybe we ought to be thinking a little bit more self-reflectively. I don't mean navel gazing. I mean true self-reflection, where we actually do something. And when we make our steps, we make it with intent to have change and actual building of a true society. So I propose that we are moving towards, rather than being program-centered, we're moving towards being human-centered. It's not about the intervention. It's not about the program. It's about the needs of the people, the recognition of power and context in history and how that plays, and understanding, as Dominica started out this aspect, in understanding that we're really talking about evaluation as a tool. We are people first. We are society. We are a human space. I'll call it the human race. That is our job here. Evaluation, the way that we live our lives, is in service of a loving civil society. That is what it is about. And of course, you all might argue with me, but that's where I'm at today after sitting through 10,000 Zoom meetings. So I did want to say a couple of things about the changing role of the evaluator, in addition to sort of being, not sort of, but really focusing towards people. It means that we are now much more people-centered. We are listeners. We are feelers. We are empathizers. Chris McGough, people have heard me talk about this because I really like it a lot. There are 3 ways to listen. He talks about that we listen with the people, to think about things with their wallet, their head, their heart. And I contend that there's a 4th way that evaluators have to know. They have to be able to listen to all of it and to be able to make a sense of where people are, being able to hear the subtext, being able to hear pain when it may look like joy, being able to see joy when it may look like pain to us. So I think as evaluators, our role is moving much more towards being part of society, being the partner, being the humans that we are in this. So I think this is where I'm at, and you're getting to hear my emotion behind that, because the first thing I hear now from people is they start out with a story for themselves. And that is where we start every time. Doesn't matter the program, doesn't matter the initiative. It is about the self. So if it's about the selves, then that's where we start. So I just want to mention the equitable evaluation framework, because ultimately we're talking about trying to privilege all of us in a way that is equitable, that is kind. That is the only way we are going to make justice, or even social justice or human justice. equity is on the way to justice. Without equity, you have no justice. If you cannot make amends for the breaches that we continue to make, you have no justice. And making the breach makes sure that we actually will ensure justice if we ever can. So I'm going to mention multicultural validity just in the sense, a shout out to Karen Kirkhart, just to talk about this idea of like evaluators who think of themselves as validity. Validity is framed by culture and context. Without culture and context, you have no validity. So I'm going to stop right there and turn it over to my esteemed colleagues to continue the conversation. Again, thank you for letting me be able to present my emotion and my thought about this. This is a mission. Thank you.
Thank you, Katrina. That was powerful and moving. And since we're on Zoom and we can't really see everybody, if you could, yes, please give it emoji applause, because these are principles that we really should like deepen into. And thank you for your bravery, Katrina. And so now we're gonna move to hearing the wisdom of Gail.
See. Okay. I think I did it. Dangak, Donna Bemnawag, Liria Gail, Sibai Nilche, Beskad Mukari, Wabanaki, Chilunyud Bejian Bemkiska. Hello, all my relatives. How are you? I am called Gail, and I'm Zibaik Gawik. I'm from a place by the edge of the water, Beskad Mukari, the Fishers of Pollock, and from Wabanaki, where we see the first light. And I'm thankful for being here with you today. So I'm going to, as I thought about, I kind of struggled with the presentation a bit because I was looking at the abstract and also listening to a lot of the presentations in CREA this year. And I thought, what about being radical? You know, what's the radical approach to evaluation from my perspective as an Indigenous woman? And so I came up with this radical critical reflection as a way to interrupt racism and oppression. So I'm going to take you on a bit of a journey with me. If I'm going to invite you to come along, and this approach to evaluation reflects who I am and also what I believe needs to happen in order to interrupt the repeating cycle that we're in. So if you would take a moment to reflect on what you see and just form a thought about that. Anybody that wants to share what that is, what do you see there? Please do. Okay, we can hold those then, and we'll see where this takes us. I am going to venture a guess that if we all put those thoughts forward, they'd all be very different. Some would be similar, but many would be different. And I want to just consider what our perspectives are and how we live together with them. Yeah. So these are the things that I want to focus on. This is my journey, and I thought about saying we should do this, or you could try this, but I'm taking it from Nilun. Nil is me. Nilunde is me and all the people that are in this space with me. How do we get in touch with who we are? So I need to get in touch with who I am and where I come from as an individual and in the collective. That means I'm getting in touch with the multiple identities that I have in both of those spaces. And they're all intertwined. So you'll look at this and say, what is that? You might not know what it is unless you're already familiar with it. So it's a topo map, and the little red circle is where I come from. And the United States is in there, Canada's in there, and the ocean is in there. So that's one look at where I come from. Here's the political view of where I come from. This is where we start to see boundaries between the United States and Canada, between states and provinces. There's Passamaquoddy ancestral territory. So I describe myself as Pascalmukari, which means the spears of Pollock, and that's why we're on the coast, because we fish. And there's also bands that are all up in that circle. And yet, there's no clear, it's not like we had a congressional congress of nations. We coexisted with other tribal groups, and it was actually kind of amorphous. So these political distinctions are those that we have had to make in order to kind of carve out a space. So it does bring up the history, though. When I look at this, it brings up our history with the oppressor, the pressure, the colonizer, white supremacy, all of those things that have injured and violated us and continue to do so. And yet we remain strongly, although injured, in the collective. So here's another way to look at the same place. And this is what you might call, it's not quite low tide, it's not quite high tide. You can see in the middle that if you look carefully, that the water is a little bit more active in that space where you could walk out if it's low. You can't go out there at all if it's high, but that mid space is dynamic and you have to pay attention to that. So the mid tide is where I often find myself actually as an evaluator and as a researcher, which is in that place where, might be too late to go over there. I need to time this. I need to pay attention to the dynamics. I need to have respect for the environment that I'm operating in. And yet, I need not to be afraid to be here. So what I'm after with this little mini journey and what I'm inviting you to think about and maybe take in a bit is, how do you show up authentically and how do you act with integrity? These two things are very important. And I find as I come into these years that I have, that those two questions are more central to, they become more important. I don't know how much time I have left. And I started thinking a little bit more seriously about that. And this is where who we are comes into play. So I'm sharing this journey with you as an Indigenous woman because it matters in how we interact when we work together. Me and any other Indigenous community that you happen to encounter is going to have very similar kind of stories. Someone said it's stories. We start with the stories. And so my mom, I'm coming up on the birthday, which is the one a month into that year when my mom passed away this winter. And so I look at that as what makes me think I would go past that. And then I look at it as she's here, right? She's come around and she's so much more present than she has been right now in this moment to try to help and guide me to the place where I need to go. So because my mother is younger to be passing away at the age that she does, that's the experience that we have. We lose our people at a much earlier age. And we live with that. And it means lots of different things. So I want to reflect that, not just for me, but for other marginalized people. That's the reality. And I'm not complaining about it, and I'm not going to be defined by it, but I'm acknowledging that that's where we are. So I've been talking a little bit about individual, but somewhat about the environment that I operate in. So it's very important for me to reflect on our interdependence. All of us that are in this space at the moment are interdependent in this, and the places that we sit, we just look around and we see how we are interdependent on each other. And as an evaluator and as a researcher, I am acutely aware. I try to always ask. I ask myself, and this is the invitation for you to ask, what is the impact of my presence? Every single day, how does me being here make a difference, both as an individual and in the collective? So the interdependence to me is what comes to mind with this photo here. It's in our ancestral territory, and it's so powerful. You know, the ocean itself is so powerful. So I have to acknowledge what I carry with me as coming from this area. I need to pay attention to how I show up, and also what am I here to learn and what am I here to see? So these are the kinds of reflections that we must engage in order to show up authentically. And I do believe, and I've had this experience, that we sometimes come with all the expectations and there's a little voice that says, wait a second, that doesn't feel right. That doesn't sound right. That doesn't sit right. And sometimes it's more than a little voice. It's like, ooh, it starts to just, you know, build up and, you know, it's going to come out and I don't know how it's going to come out, but that happens. And in order to have integrity, we need to honor that. And the radical change is to let that be there, let it come out, make space so that others can do the same, because those conversations that we're not having and those places that we're not going depend on us being brave enough to do that. So one of the questions that has to do with personal integrity is, you know, how do I serve? I witnessed a colleague who I highly respect. This was just a couple of days ago. And she came to this group that's been working together on an evaluation project for 3 years with organizations that are led by people from the communities in which they're situated. And it's philanthropy, and I often work in philanthropy. It's a tough crowd. It's just a tough crowd. And so she came and she said, I am not going to be here with you in January. She said, I don't know if I'm the right person to be here right now. What I do is I go under your wing and I help lift up the people who are doing the work. And there's no place for me right now to do that. It's just not the right time or the right place. And I find myself in places like that, where I have to ask, who am I serving? Because in one project, for instance, it's clear, it is crystal clear to me that we are working for the philanthropy, hands down. Although the intention is to be doing an evaluation of the project with partners, community-based partners. However, partnership, we're not there yet. We're just not there yet. And working for, when I say I want to do this work for the partners, I want to work for the partners. I can do work for you all, but I don't know if I'm the right one to be in this place at this moment, because the work I want to do is to lift up the partners' voices and to help effect change in that way. So question comes up, who do I serve? How do I serve? And in terms of practice in Indigenous communities, there are some of the things that I think that we live by. And you'll see in this photo here, we do a lot. We respect each other intergenerationally. And there's reciprocity. Reciprocity is something we've heard about, I think, in this CREA gathering, as well as other places. And we have responsibility. Lots of times you hear about rights, and among Indigenous people, you're going to hear about responsibilities. If you're grounded in the language, it's not just about what you have a right to, it's what your responsibilities are. And so me showing up as my full authentic self as an Indigenous person includes some of those things. So the other piece that I think is critical, foundational, essential, is reflecting on power. So I can take this and I can look at that and say, okay, where's the power there? What kind of power are we talking about? When I look at this, and when I was here in this space, I'm just filled with the enormity of the power there. And it's part of who we are. I mean, that sand is made up of all the people that have come before us. So it's us too. Then I can look at a space. Okay, what does that look like in terms of power? How does that strike me? Who are the people up there? Where am I situated? Do I dare go there? Do they let me go there? Can I even get there? Am I even physically able to get there? So where the power is situated and how it is structured is an essential question, and I do think it fundamental that we ask those questions in our work. And if we are not asking about power, and if we are not illustrating the power equation, then it feels to me that we are not fulfilling our responsibility. Because if we can see it, and if we can see some of these things that other people may not see, if we don't bring it to the table, then we're doing everyone a disservice, including ourselves. And so that may be, and often is, the thing that is the most uncomfortable. That's what causes the reaction when you start talking about power, when you start talking about decision making, and you start asking the questions, how's that decision made? Who gets to see that? Who gets to be at the table? Who knew about it and who didn't? So I think we have a little, I've just talked about some of these things, except that I didn't specifically use the word trust. It's such a fragile thing. And I fully am, I'm fully subscribed to the idea that this is my, what would you call it, covenant? Trust is a covenant for me. And without that, and which is to say, I say, build it and maintain it. It's not like you get it once and it's there and you can take it home and put it on the mantle. No, it's always a work in progress. But if I don't work to do that with the communities that I engage with and in the evaluation work that I do, I am not bringing forward those voices. I'm not doing it because I bring too much of myself into it and they don't trust it. I know how that works with me, I know how it works with me. So it's reciprocity. It's a part of reciprocity. What does reciprocity require? That's a part of it. So here's a quote that I really like, and just to go to my scholarly self, Paulo Freire. It resonates for me. The inquiry, the reflection, praxis, practicing, doing, making an action. In Passamaquoddy, you cannot say something like honesty. You cannot say knowledge. You cannot abstract qualities. They're all active. I can say so-and-so carries knowledge. This person is compassionate, shows compassion. This person treats people well. I cannot talk about these things without talking about the people who are actually doing them. So praxis has a real deep meaning for me. And the restless, impatient, continuing hopeful inquiry. That's radical. If we keep ourselves in the movement, if we keep moving and not being satisfied with the stasis. So I hope that you find some value in the things that I've brought forward. And it's not the usual approach to scholarship. We've got a lot of that going on out there. And I'm hoping that what we do and what we continue to do, what we already are doing, is to really look at and critically evaluate how we do things, how we approach them, and come with our whole selves so that we can engage in that conflict that Katrina said, mentioned, where without that conflict, without trying to resolve that with each other, we're just going to travel along kind of inauthentically, let me say. Knowledge.
Thank you, Gail. That just so many layers of wisdom there. So everybody, please, again, since we're in the Zoom room, we can't really hear each other. Give Gail some love with some emojis. And as we do that, we'll transition to Donna.
Hey, I don't know about you, but I'm quite emotionally engaged with this, and just acknowledging that I am in the greater Washington, D.C. area on the land of the Piscataway, and carrying the consciousness of the oppressive society in which we live, being just completely blown away by the fact that I'm here together with these fellow travelers who want radical change, and the opportunity to share with all of you some of the thoughts and and things that we're struggling with. I was struck by the theme of the meeting being focused on race and colonial status, and asking questions about what else is culturally responsive net. It has such power and can be thrown to a wider space. And in saying that, what I'm hoping is that we can, as a community, see our roles of social activism as looking at any form of injustice and feeling that pain and saying, I don't want to be complicit in sustaining this oppression, sustaining this discrimination, no matter what the basis of it is. And let's see, how do I move my slide forward? It says I am, so let's see. All right, okay. I mean, we live in this moment of the visibility of racism through the desecration of sacred land, through the killing of Black people, through the immigration policies, through the missing Indigenous peoples. And this is something that we need to be attentive to. We need to incorporate this knowledge of history and how we came to be here into the work that we do as culturally responsive evaluators. But I also want to raise up the issues of injustice on the basis of so many dimensions, whether it's your hearing status. Many of you know that my roots are in the deaf community, and that I came there as a hearing person, humbly wanting to learn what is it that I could do as a hearing person to stand beside and to work with members of a community who benefit from having a visual language, but who were told for so many years by hearing people that you can't have access to that language. That I see people living in poverty. I see the need for rights for everyone. It's so obvious in Afghanistan what's happening with women, closing the schools, denying girls the right to have an education, recognizing women's rights are violated across the world, that we need to be fighting for justice for all. And that's really the whole point of what I want to share with you. In looking at the culturally responsive evaluation, the transformative evaluation that Katrina brought in as a way of helping us see that there's multiple ways of looking at what we're trying to do, and that within the transformative ethical assumption saying that if you're not working from a culturally responsive stance, then I don't see how you can call your work ethical. That we need to be really attending to what within this context is being used as a basis of discrimination, looking seriously at that concept of intersectionality. It can be race and gender, it can be gender and sexual identity, that in each of the contexts in which we work, we need to be paying attention to what is it within this context that we need to be attentive to if we're actually going to be supporting the increase in justice and looking at justice from the social, economic, and environmental aspects. And this is something that Gail brings up through her use of the pictures from nature. In my encounters with nature, every time I just say to myself, we need to do something to protect this. Anything that we're doing that's being destructive to nature, to the environment, is also destructive to social justice. And so looking at those methodological implications and saying, how do we incorporate that cultural responsiveness? How do we incorporate the contextual analysis? How do we identify those bases of discrimination? How do we develop the coalitions that are necessary to inform the evaluation and to sustain the transformative changes? How do we share that power with the communities? And how do we give deliberate consideration to these aspects of justice? And so that's really the framing for what I wanted to talk about. And I wanted to bring up one example that I think combines this transformative, culturally responsive within the community of sexual minorities. And this is based on the work of Robin Miller and her colleagues. And I tell you, when she shared this work with me, I thought this is just such an amazing example of application of these principles. If we want to see how it can be done, we can look at her work. She was working in 7 African and Caribbean countries that I have listed on the slide. In all of these countries, manifestation of relationships between same-sex people is against the law and punishable by prison and even death. That is the basis of discrimination that has the highest relevancy within these contexts. And in her approach to the evaluation, she worked with coalitions, with the health agencies, with advocacy organizations, with identity organizations, with political organizations to say, how can we work together to create safe spaces for this work to go forward? And in doing that, addressing the power issues and saying, what we need to do is to start with the people who are from those communities and say, how do you experience your access to healthcare? What is going on with you? How could we begin to understand better how to investigate that? And not saying, I have those 5 methods of data collection that Katrina talked about, and that the community members said, look, we want to have this being a living data collection. So we want to be going into the clinics and collecting that data. And then the evaluator can say, well, what's that going to look like? Well, you know, it could look like this. And so they came up with criteria for things that they thought would be important. And they made it into a checklist. And then they went into the clinics and they started the data collection process. And they came back out before it was finished, during the process, and said, look, this is killing us. The stress from all this is killing us. And so what did the evaluator do? Because she's a human being and she operates as a human being during this process, and says, we got to change. We need to give you better skills for how to support each other, how to operate in adverse contexts, how to have that kind of psychological support that you need in order to continue this work as you see fit. And so all of the things that were a part of this study, to me, were just, how do we do cultural response? How do we do transformative? How do we recognize what's relevant in terms of the discrimination, the addressing of power, the recognition that we are human beings and we work with human beings, particularly in a very risky environment. Look at her work and see how it's action oriented, see how it pays attention to people. And that, you know, it just gives me hope that we have people who are conducting this kind of work in these kind of adverse contexts, and we can learn from how they're doing it. Another aspect that I have come to understand as being so important is we've talked about being social activists and social change agents. So do we learn from the social activism community? Do we integrate things from their communities so that we can bring that into our work? How much of this would we be willing to maybe surface and say, could we consider, if we want to really address issues of poverty, that we work with unions, with grassroots organizations, that we start holding rallies, that we work with Twitter, with Facebook, we work with the press, we bring together these coalitions of different religious groups, ministers, rabbis, that we work with the city council, the government officials, members of African American, Latinos, the LGBT communities, looking at campaigns that are already there, the Poor People's Campaign, the NAACP. And this is what it took for the fast food community to put together the Fast Food Justice Coalition that has now been successful in raising the minimum wage in 24 states to $15 an hour. It's a graduated increase. It's not immediate. Everyone doesn't get $15 an hour immediately. The House passed Raise the Wage Act. President Biden argued that the federal minimum wage should be changed from $15 to $7, from $7.25 an hour, which it has been for decades. And so we don't know if that's going to happen with the federal government because of all the politics, but look at what it took in the states to see this happen. How can we integrate more of that into what we do if we claim to be social change agents? This was also done with the fruit pickers down in Florida, where the conditions really were modern day slavery. And that took a coalition of workers, the Catholic Church, foundations, and they engaged with students from 300 universities and 50 high schools, which was really significant. The National Council of Churches, Presbyterian Church, dozens of synagogues. They used not data collection like, surveys, checklists, but weekly skits with the farm workers and social justice, and engaging in data collection through real life performances, through leadership training, setting up a radio station, having strikes, having a protest march, and very, very importantly, having a national boycott that was instigated by the students. 300 universities and 50 high school students had a boycott of Taco Bell and other fast food restaurants. And then what happened? They established the Campaign for Fair Food. Taco Bell and other restaurants agreed to pay more for their tomatoes, and they agreed to adopt a code of conduct. This group of people, this coalition, the Campaign for Fair Food, now has a website where people who experience injustices in the field are able to go there and get legal representation and demand changes. So what are we willing to do? That's the question. And I also wanted to bring up that when we look at issues around prisons, incarceration, we almost always have the narrative around race, which is very, very appropriate given the history, the dimensions of diversity that have been used for discrimination, legislation, policies, and that we could look at the war on drugs and see what happened as a basis of that was the overrepresentation of people of color in the prisons. We had excessive incarceration on the basis of the war on drugs and the legislation that supported that. And then there was a coalition of legal advisors, court systems who said, let's lobby for diversion programs in our courts. Let's see if instead of incarcerating people, we can actually give them the services that they need to have a better quality of life and to get out of the drugs and the addiction. And so I was able to work with one court system in Oregon that adopted the diversion program. They started with looking at the history of the legislation. They looked at the bases of discrimination. They said, what we need is to form a coalition within the justice system, and this included the court officials, the lawyers, from representatives from the police department, advocacy organizations, and in this court, the people who were in the court were people with mental health problems who also had drug addiction. And what they needed then was the support and services to address their mental health, but all the other kinds of social support that's needed. So they had teams of people who might include social workers, housing, people who worked with the justice system, people who worked with addiction centers, and they had team meetings around each person who came into the diversion program to find out from that program, what is it that you need? What are the barriers that you're experiencing? How do we help you overcome those barriers? And what they found was that they were having success in terms of uptake of services, less recidivism, people feeling more grounded and able and empowered to take charge of their lives. But there were two groups that were not getting the support that they needed: people who were members of sexual minorities, especially if they were from the Latino community, who felt that they simply could not come out into public and to talk about the things that were worrisome to them, even in terms of trying to address the issues of abuse that they were experiencing, and that this needed engagement with the Latino community, with the sexual advocacy for the sexual minorities community, in order to come up with strategies that were going to be useful. They also found that they were not sufficiently or effectively addressing the needs of veterans. I mean, we all know about the PTSD. It gets headlines every once in a while, but this was a group where they needed to build coalitions that were wider, to include members of that community who could be the support that was needed for veterans who are experiencing mental health issues and addiction issues. And so, yes, they did a quantitative analysis of the uptake of services and recidivism, but they also looked at a content analysis, what went on in the court system, what went on in those team meetings, and then interviews with people to say, how's this working? What do we need to change? What other kinds of supports do we need? And so something like this also gives me hope, because you think of the justice system and the word justice, it's almost like you're, you know, if you're like me, the insides of you kind of clench up when you hear that word justice system. But these are people inside that system saying, we're taking this seriously. We want to do what is culturally responsive for a community that's experiencing mental health issues and drug addiction issues, and trying to prevent them from having to sit out the period of time with no support in incarceration. And so I think we have challenges that we need to face as a community. And I mentioned that I got grounding in the ideas of diversity within the deaf community. There's a recent book, it's 2021, that's just come out, School to Prison Nexus, Deaf Youth in the Juvenile Justice System, Deaf People in the Criminal Justice System. And in that book, of course, there's acknowledgement that the deaf community simply has not been visible in the work that's being done in the justice system, in the prison system. And yet, when you look at the kind of cultural and contextual aspects, how could we as culturally responsive evaluators become more informed, more supportive, more of advocates to say, look, police brutality happens because someone who is deaf is told that we have to, stop, raise your hands, they hear nothing. And so what happens is being shot, being arrested, being brutalized for resistance to arrest when it is a communication issue. After the arrest, what happens? Their hands are handcuffed behind their backs. They have no language access. We know that legally they're supposed to provide interpreters. We also know they don't. We also know that they do interrogations without interpreters, from which they get false confessions and people who accept plea deals because they simply don't know what's going on. And somebody's telling them, you can just shake your head and sign this paper. And so we also see that school to prison pipeline. We see kids being put from the juvenile justice system into foster homes with parents who don't sign. And so these are cultural aspects that as culturally responsive evaluators, I raise up just for visibility to say, how are we extending that net to incorporate the cultural contexts that have dimensions of diversity such as this? And so I'm just going to close out. You can see Katrina and me standing at the Martin Luther King Monument in Washington, D.C. with our power stance and just asking us, you know, we don't have the answers to all of these things. We don't give enough attention to that intersection of social, environmental, and economic justice. When we talk about how to resolve issues of poverty, we need also to keep those environmental aspects front and center and the social aspects front and center, that we need to be inclusive and culturally responsive, ensuring that we have effective communications. So as Gail was talking about the languages within her community, the deaf community have their own languages, building in those strategies for sustainability, incorporating those social activism strategies as much as we can, being very conscious of addressing those power inequities by design. And there are challenges, but we need to situate our cultural responsiveness in terms of context and in terms of the contextual determinants of discrimination. And so just a few questions to close it out. What do we need to support effective engagement, communication, and support to authentically address the inequities in all the communities that experience discrimination? How can evaluators build coalitions to incorporate diverse constituencies with different sources of power in safe ways into the design of the study? How can we assess the quality of relationships and the impact of including diverse voices in the evaluation? And what is the role of the culturally responsive evaluation community in addressing inequities resulting in discrimination and oppression based on dimensions of diversity in addition to race and ethnicity? So just saying, this is my life's work. I write obsessively about it. I have a website. I keep my email very accessible because I really believe it takes all of us working together to reach a solution. So with that, I will turn it back over to Dominica and hope that we can have a spirited discussion, answer questions. So back to you, Dominica.
Donna, just like powerful, concrete, insightful. So everybody, please give Donna some love with some emojis. Just great guidance for us as agents of social change in this work. So I just want to highlight a few things that stood out for me across these great presentations. One is that the current status quo is a vacuum. If we are not actively going towards the goal, towards the transformation, towards the possibility, we are being sucked into and uplifting and upholding the present status quo. And so there are micro to macro level strategies that we can do, starting with centering in ourselves as full human beings with our own stories, our own psyche, and examining ourselves, deepening into that reflection, acknowledging that our mindset is shaped by this broader oppressive status quo, and that we do that then in our work. Again, like that's the default unless we are actively growing and going in a different direction. And that we really need to tap into the unseen, our own subconscious or our unseen stories, or our ancestors' unseen stories or unheard stories. We need to tap into the unseen to do this work well and to do this work more powerfully. And there's so much to learn from nature in this work. Gail, I loved your picture, it's all the pictures, but the picture of the birds and the ocean, as well as that broader ocean around power, right? It just lets us know and reminds us that power is everywhere. Power is coursing through our veins. It is a false perception that some people have power and some people don't. It's just everywhere, right? And it's part of like us examining our story and ourselves that allows us to tap into the power that's within and then move with others. And then to that macro level, that we are interdependent and that we work with other organizations and movements in order to move all of this forward. So with that, I just want to open it up to comments and questions from all of you.
Gail, I wanted to ask if you could elaborate on reciprocity, because the one thing that I have such, my passion is that it ought to serve social, economic, and environmental justice. It ought to. But I'm also really careful about not making promises I can't keep. And so I wonder if you could kind of share some reflection on reciprocity and how you work with community to say we want to advance this agenda, but we also need to have that sense of we don't want to violate your trust by promising you things we can't do.
For me, I had this conversation just yesterday with someone about leadership and how we all recognize leadership in organizations and how we structure governance and leadership. And one of the things that comes to me is, so where I come from, there's a couple of things. First of all, the women have a powerful role because of our life experience and what we are looked upon to do and be in society. And so where I come from, the women would raise up men who would be not the leader, but the spokesperson. And that individual is a spokesperson because that is the person who is expected to be speaking on the other side of the equation. That's the one that you put out there to negotiate things, because women are not seen in every society as having that kind of power. And so in answer to the question of, well, how do you know? The way I receive that question is like, how do you know which direction to go in when you want change? I have to be as humble as I possibly can be. I have to open up in this part of my life. I conscientiously open up space. I make explicit relationships and connections that I see, with me and the next person who's in, whoever's on this Zoom, right? I could pick someone out and say, this is how I see us being connected. And then I open up that space so that I'm not looked at as the one that has to do all the talking. I need to know where this community wants to go. My role is to be under that wing, and helping to generate a little bit of lift. And so in terms of reciprocity, what I've said most recently, it's like, I am so heartened when I'm in the same room with some of these young women and men who are moving the needle. I mean, they are asking the questions. They are unapologetic about their inquiry. And so that's the reciprocity for me. It's like, okay, I'm feeling it. I'm feeling you. I'm feeling your energy come back.
Thanks, Gail. And just want to uplift Donna's question to you all. Do you try for radical change? How and what happened? And if you do have a question, we're still welcoming questions and other comments. We have about 8 minutes left.
Dominica, I know that you structure your work so you really engage with communities with a real sense of consciously addressing politics and power and mobilizing communities and building up that capacity so that they can be the ones who take lead on what's important to them. And I just wondered if you could share some of what you do with that, because to me that's radical, and I love that you do it.
So I'll give like one small step that we try to include in every evaluation that both engages people as well as possibility. And we like to start, meaning become, for those of you who I don't know or haven't met, I'm founder and CEO of Become. We're a nonprofit innovative movement building organization based in Chicago, and do a lot of work with Black and Brown communities and institutions. And one of the steps in our process is a visioning session where we engage community and other people who have been impacted or impact the program or institution, and we engage them in the same space to vision for the program, or vision for the possibility, or vision for themselves, or vision for the evaluation. And then we're guided by their voice, and we're guided by their hopes and their critical questions. And so right off the bat, we're deepening into both their present and their possibility. And then other ways that we have engaged community have been like through trainings, offering trainings around evaluative thinking, around systems thinking, around social cohesion, and then creating community, creating a unified field. So one example is our work through Courage to Love around infant mortality. And this was really, this is a collaborative. It's with other institutions, a healthcare institution, a community corporation, development corporation, an organization that's providing direct services to people who are to especially mothers who are blocked from accessing the care that they need through their pregnancy. And so working with them, bringing our toolkit, including evaluation, to that, but all coming together and bringing community together to shape solutions on their block. And so we did a year-long program where we did that, and then now moving to see like what are the lessons learned. So we're currently in the process from that project of raising funds to like expand the lessons learned from that work from community. But yeah, other examples out there in the crowd, or the questions?
Yeah, I'd love to hear from some folks, because I know y'all are doing that work. It's just, you know, it's work. So sometimes people are tired, but we'd love to hear.
While we wait, Katrina, I'd really like if you could reflect on, you know, you've made a big challenge to the evaluation community, to CREA, to AEA. in your vision, where do we go? How do we get there? What's the radical change process? Or
Yeah. This is an ongoing conversation I have in myself and with other people, but first of all, some of the things I'd love to see, and I know that there's some happening going in that direction. I'd like to see the way we award. Let's think about the way we think about how we recognize and give love and award people for their contributions to evaluation, the practice, the field, the way we think about it. And I think we really have to get outside of that box, because that box, and I'm just starting with that box is really very traditional. It's very traditional. It's very academic. No offense to the academicians at all, because I consider myself as half an academician as well. But it's very traditional. It's very white male focused on what is considered objectivity and what is considered a good theory, what's considered a good practice. I'd like to see that we really sit down and think about what that looks like, and who has access to that. And because there are a lot of folks out there doing so amazing work that don't register in that space, but they should, because making a huge contribution that changes the way we think about our work with communities. I think we ought to be able to think very differently about that. I'd also like to see the way that we train. Again, we still train in those methods, those things. We're there. And I'm not trying to throw out the whole, I'm not trying to throw everything out. I just want us to think broadly about what that means, and not the methods per se, but what are we driving towards? And I haven't thought about like what that looks like, but it's like, what are we driving towards? And maybe that might really open up the way that we think about methods and methodology. And then just in general, the way that we award contracts. When we're thinking about contracting and our funders and all of this, and I know that there's currently a move by the federal government a little bit to sort of think about EDI perspectives, but I really would like to see that us think about that space of what does it mean if you write a proposal and it doesn't fit into social justice, maybe you don't get funded, and it's not squeezed in at the last minute. Oh yeah, we're going to get to those people, kind of thing. So those are three things that Leon and I talk about ad nauseum about that as well. But those are just some of the spaces and starting. And I even still think that, and I'm still in that framework, and I'm trying to get out of that framework because I think it's much broader than that. But thanks for asking, Donna.
Thank you for sharing that. And all of the presentations were really great. In terms of what you just shared, Dr. Bledsoe, I have been thinking about how definitely this compensation and award frame structure that we have, and then this whole notion of redress. So it's a lot of work to redress all of this stuff that is in front of us, and that causes all these inequalities and everything that you talked about in your presentation. But then when you go to ask for the appropriate compensation to do the requisite work, there are all these question marks on top of people's heads. Then there is this posturing or this feeling like, I don't really know what you're talking about. I don't understand it. We're not ready for that. Then there is this, I can do it now. I understand it now. So now I'm doing it off the back of you bringing it in front of me. But I told you, I understand it back then and it shouldn't cost that much. But now I'm doing it because I better understand some ideas that come out of your cognitive schema. And to be honest, I'm just kind of like, like you said, it feels like slavery down here. I was like, I just wanted to add that those those lived experiences to really give that some context, because that's what's happening. And I mean, I know it's not as academic as I'd like it to sound, but that's what's up. We really need to, I think, have an honest conversation about that. I think it was Gail who said show up authentically. Well, I'm showing up authentically, having scrapped that idea that I got to work 10 times harder to get half the credit. I don't subscribe to that. I'm not there. That was generation before me. And so now it's like, okay, we need redress and remuneration for the incredible amount of work that we're trying to help to have other people recognize the humanity in all of us.
Gail, I'm gonna let you have the word.
No, I just so appreciate you coming forward with that, because we don't talk about that, and yet it's pervasive. It's co-optation. It's another stealing in a way. And it's another coming from the place where somebody has to take ownership of everything that's created. And so articulating that and bringing it forward and saying, okay, we need to address this. These are some of the areas that are uncomfortable, but it's more of the same until we interrupt it and until we say, no, we're not doing this anymore. So I appreciate that.
And with that, we're a little bit over time. Thank you everybody for your insight and attention and being here with us for this conversation. And we plan for this to be an ongoing conversation of learning and growing together. So please reach out to any of us with comments, questions, ideas, continued conversation, and yeah, have good days, have a good weekend.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Bye.
you. Thank you all. Thank you so much.